Piña Soul Podcast with Dr. Jessica Hernandez.
Welcome to episode 6 of the Piña Soul Podcast. Today we're joined by Otilia Portillo Padua, director and producer of Daughters of the Forest. Deep in the forests of Mexico, two indigenous mycologists seek to reconcile the past and present while reimagining the future in the rapidly changing climate. Daughters of the Forest explores the connections between humans and mushrooms, the visible and invisible, in indigenous knowledge and modern science. This immersive sci-fi documentary invites us to rethink our relationships with the human and non-human roles and to imagine new possibilities for living in reciprocity with Earth. Joining us, Otilia. It's an honor to be interviewing you, especially for your documentary entitled Daughters of the Forest. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and what inspired you to do this documentary?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the space. Dr. Hernandez, it's a pleasure to be here. Well, basically, Daughters of the Forest is a film that follows the trajectories of two indigenous mycologists. One is Zapotec from the Central Valleys of Oaxaca, and then the other one is Elisete Ramirez Carvajal, which is Tlahuica-Pejiaco, which is Mexico State, so only 2 hours away from Mexico City. It's in a very lush forest nearby, near a national park called Lagunas de Zempoala. And it follows their life, but also follows how mushrooms shaped their lives and their futures. So this film was premiered in March at at CPH in Copenhagen, and then it was at South by where it won an audience award. And since it's been in San Francisco and the Margaret Mead, it's going to be in DC Docs. I'm here right now in LA for the Hollywood Climate Summit. So basically it's been moving around. It's basically a documentary, but it has some touches of speculative fiction.
Yeah, thank you. I noticed that, especially in the introduction, right? Like I felt like there was a lot of focus on the natural sounds that the forest makes, which oftentimes when we are in the environments, right, we forget to listen to nature. So that was very beautiful. And what inspired you to tell their story, especially given that, you know, you're focusing on mycologists, indigenous mycologists, which is tends to be something that mainstream environmental documentaries rarely focus on, right? Like when we focus on the forest, it's more of like the holistic forest, but not so much on the mycology, the fungi communities in the forest.
But first of all, it's very interesting because actually the movie starts with a writer and a sci-fi writer called Ursula K. Le Guin, and she wrote in the 70s this essay called The Carrier-Bag Theory of Fiction. And in this essay, she basically touches on the first human tool of civilization, according to this female anthropologist, in which she talks about the vessel, like a carrier bag, a basket. So the foraging as the first tool of human race civilization, rather than what we conceive as like the sword or a thing to kill something else. It was the basket. So in that sense, she said that she really thought that although she understood the hero journey as a narrative form didn't really describe her experience. And she thought there was space to talk about stories more like vessels, like carrier. And so from that essay, I was like, well, what is a vessel story? What would a container story, a woven story would be like? What are the threads that would be this story? What's the knowledge contained in this carrier bag? And from then, like, we discovered, you know, that there was this incredible foraging community that had a really strong relationship with mushrooms for a longer time than even fungus became popular. You know, right? Like for the last couple of years, we've heard a lot about mushrooms and they're everywhere. But I was like, what about all these individuals that have had such a strong, intimate relationship for generations with fungi? And where are they in this bigger conversation? And I think so. It was the basket that took us to the mushroom, and the mushroom kind of guided us with its mycelium root system to the woman that were the carriers of this knowledge vessel.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because it's very beautiful, right? Because yeah, you are right. Foraging, I mean, mushrooms are not necessarily as heavily impacted in the environmental discourse, right? When people study, like that's one of the last things they want to study. But in social media, foraging has become this like trend that many people are doing and becoming kind of like famous for it, but they're not necessarily integrating the indigenous perspectives that have been in there for you know generations and millennia. One of the things that I really liked, and I don't know if this was like your intention, was that when I was like seeing the film, there was like this in a way influence of indigenous futurism
futurisms, or indigenous future. Because oftentimes, right, when we see documentaries on indigenous peoples, like it's important to focus on the past, but in even the right, and even though this essay that you started with in the documentary is from the 70s, there is this sense of indigenous futurism. What was your vision including that indigenous futurism into the documentary?
I think, I mean, in a way, that I felt like there was always something slightly sci-fi speculative about this woman going to commune with this ancestral being, like this being that the mycelium, this invisible network that we don't see. We see the fruit of the mushroom, but we don't see the mycelium normally all the time. We kind of see it manifest itself when it rains and when you see the fruit. But otherwise, there's this mycelium. And I thought there was something very, an incredible sense of futuristic about woman going and convening with this being. I mean, already as a sci-fi premise. But I think I was very inspired by this because we have a notion of what a hero is and what a hero does. And it's mostly masculine, and it's mostly he kills another being that is strange or alien to himself, and it's antagonistic force. And so in a way the film is not anchored in tensions of conflict. It's how you weave in forms of knowledge and you have a communication and a nurturing with this other. And in the sense, this other being is a multiple of beings, it's not one entity, it's the fungal world. And I thought there was already something very, even though the past is there and the present is there, and they're not necessarily as objective realities, they're more like possibilities. They're not necessarily literal. The present is always sort of evolving. The past is always there, feeding from the present, and the future is the sense of the possible. So in a sense, I think the film, because in Latin America what happens a lot, and I think it's because at some point the label of magical realism was used to label everything in Latin America. Like it was magical and it was realism, and I think at some point it got overused to the point that everything that comes to America is magical realism. And there was a sense, no, sci-fi is kept for Western civilizations or technology or technocracy or computers. And what about all forms of knowledge? What about biology? What about anthropology? What about mysticism? I mean, there are forms of sci-fi in that. There's spiritual sci-fi. And I think by meeting Lise and Julie and a web, because I think they only represent a generation of a lot of webs of girls that are in the intersection between some of them studying Western academics and their own knowledge, which comes from their families, and whether vessels of all of this knowledge that comes before them. I think I was very inspired by what the future could hold if they were the heroes, like if we could see these girls as they changed their lives and that of their communities with what they had around them, and what they had around them was mushrooms.
Yeah, that's very beautiful, right? Because even you're mentioning magical realism, like coming from Latin America myself, like it tends to in a way freeze indigenous communities in the past. Like every time we see a film that has magical realism and involves indigenous peoples, it's like this romanticization of our cultures. But I really like that you integrated sci-fi, right? Because it removes that romanticization that freezes indigenous peoples and brings in these two women that you're mentioning into the discourse, right? Into the protagonist in role, as opposed to just being a side note, which tends to happen with that. Like I can think of like even Disney with the movie Coco, is very magical, ¿verdad? Entonces, in that sense, it's like freezing even a tradition in the past, even though that tradition has evolved from what the film portrayed. Another really liked is that you shifted how you're talking about climate, especially climate change, from this apocalyptic narrative, right? Where it's like the gloom and doom, and you kind of shifted that storytelling into the futures, into optimism. What was your decision into doing that, or how did that come about? Was it influenced by the two protagonists or women that you follow in the documentary?
I think it was mostly influenced by them, by this realization there were people working with what they had around them. It was also heavily influenced by the mushrooms itself, by the resilience, by the adaptability, but that they defy kind of like preconceptions and labels about what they are. On one hand, you can also romanticize mushrooms like this, all collaborative beings, but mushrooms are also very opportunistic. They seize opportunities, they degrade, they degrade matter, they integrate on sort of death into the life cycle. So and it's not like they're all bright. They're complex beings that we haven't really completely understood. So I think what happens is that obviously the film is permeated with loss. There is the loss of territory. There is the loss of forest. There is the loss of our ancestors or our elders, of a knowledge, of our dreams. Sometimes you want to do something like Julie. She has this dream of what her future holds, and it doesn't happen. And so does permeate love, but it's basically learning that because the mushrooms in a way are the non-human teachers in the whole film, like how can they shape loss? And in that sense, how can we understand that there's always going to be loss as a part of the cycle of life, but how do we integrate that loss and not allow that loss to completely define us? And in a way, in the whole climate story right now, there's this sense of there's obviously a lot of despair, and there's a lot of sense that we can't do anything about the future in the bigger sense, or even about our futures. And I thought that here we are with examples of two girls that, they don't have that much resources, and yet they do all these things with what they have. And so I was like, why is that not an inspiration for us? Like me, like a city person or anyone, like how can we not, make little things that matter on an everyday basis? How we not relate to the other, be more empathetic, not only to the human world, but to the non-human world. And in that sense, I was like, that's how we can believe that we can have an action and shape our futures, not in the bigger heroic scale, but in the smaller community way that we are as people on an everyday basis.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I feel like even talking to my elders in my community in Oaxaca, oftentimes they say that despair is a way for people to remove responsibilities from their roles, right? Like if we're in despair, we're like, well, we cannot do anything. We're no longer responsible for trying to heal whatever is happening. And oftentimes in Latin America and in indigenous and local communities of Latin America, we use that in the way that joy as a form of resistance, ¿verdad? Like we use remove from that despair so that we can actually continue to have hope for the future. And this is why our cultures tend to be very joyful, ¿verdad? Like even in dancing and the music that we do. So I really love that you integrated that into that. And one of the things that I really admire about the film is that you are very careful in ensuring that you're not sharing sacred knowledge, right? And I'm assuming that there was some sacred knowledge that was shared with you, but how did you go about respecting indigenous knowledge systems in a way that they were respectfully represented in the film and were not necessarily as extractive? Like what was your approach in ensuring that also sacred knowledge that oftentimes if it falls in the wrong hands, right, is co-opted? And we see that a lot with indigenous communities and the stuff that sometimes we share, ¿verdad? Like my abuelita always said, you got to be careful with what we share, because sometimes it's repackaged in Western society and then sold, and then our communities do not necessarily benefit. So what was your approach in deciding what to do in that sense?
I think that there were sort of multiple approaches. One, the beginning is that we do know the story of Maria Sabina. We do in Mexico, and I hope more people know about this story, where you have an incredibly wise woman that shared some of her incredible knowledge of the sacred mushroom to the West. Well, she shared it to a particular person and to a particular group of people with the agreed verbal agreement, like your word does matter. No, in this case scenarios, it's not like a written contract. Word in those spaces matters, and the trust you build really matters. And there was this breach of trust. So basically the whole knowledge of the sacred mushroom was taken. There was this betrayal of Maria Sabina and the figure of Maria Sabina, and then the whole changed completely. So this is information, though there's, of course, the psilocybin has been synthesized. There's a lot of information, studies on how it's a brain. There's psilocybin mushrooms all over the world, not only in Mexico, but, there was the relationship as an oracle for the holy mushroom was very particular to the Mazatecs and probably to other cultures that we don't know about. So that backstory was always present when we were approaching. So we're very aware of that. So I think the way we started it, we started first, we approached their mentors, like how we started working with them is we worked with the scientists, a very humane group of scientists in Texcoco, which study the land and, have a lot of fields. So this group of doctors basically have worked with a lot of indigenous students from all over Mexico. And they, although they're very scientific and, they make papers in Western magazines and stuff, they have an incredible respect to other forms of knowledge. So indigenous science matters. and ethnomycology is a really big field in Mexico, so it matters much. So during the film, there was always this conversation about, even, you know, in academia, not only with film, it was like, okay, so we give this knowledge, and then we never hear back from them. We don't get the paper, we don't get quoted, we don't even get like, she mentions it like in a very, she means she's laughing, but it's very true. We don't even get a Coke. We don't get like, or a mezcal or an acknowledgement, no? So for us, I mean, so instead of like, because we had these mentors that were doctors that have worked very carefully and a lot of reciprocity, there was always this sense of, let's not antagonize. Let's not, you know, like in Western narratives, we always want to create the conflict, you know, like anchor everything on the tensions between two forms of things. I was like, no, it's a conversation. So the whole film was always a conversation back and forth with them about, okay, this is what's fine to share. This is what's not fine to share. This is how much you want to, like, for example, for Lisa, it was very important that it was understood that she was a node. Like, she was carrying knowledge that didn't necessarily belong, that she didn't generate, like generations behind her generated. So, you know, it's in a way, the film organically grew into mycelium, the way in the same, the conversations sort of. So it was, I think there was always this sense of, you know, consent, like, what do you want to show? What do you don't want to show? There's obviously no, I mean, because, for example, with the toxic mushrooms, let's not go into the psychedelics. With toxic mushrooms, there's some of this knowledge maybe cost people's lives. You know, like the difference between eating an edible mushroom or a toxic mushroom or a deadly mushroom, I mean, represented somebody, I don't know, an animal, someone risking maybe their life for this knowledge. But in a way, I heard from a mycologist just one day that he said that he trusted a foraging woman more than he trusted a mycologist in terms of knowledge about which mushroom to eat. So he's like, if my mycologist tells me to eat this mushroom, I won't necessarily trust it. But if a woman that collects mushroom tells me, I trust her. Because for them, that knowledge is the thread between living and dying. And so I guess because we didn't anchor, you know, we didn't try to make conflict. We didn't force conflict. You know, a lot of it, you know, when you're trying to fund the film, people are like, what's the conflict? What's going to drive the thing? Who's going to attack whatever? But that was never the premise. The premise was like a growing conversation where there was all these things that I wasn't going to be able to know. And there was things that were fine to remain mysteries. And then I could be like, yeah, you know, I'm going to be an outsider on this knowledge and I'm never going to completely understand it. And it's going to be fine. Like, it's fine. I don't need to know everything. Like, so I don't need to completely understand why for Julie it's fine to say that the mushroom talks and it's a sacred being. And at the same time, practicing a taxonomy on it. Like, which would seem like, well, that's such a contradiction. But like, how can you dissect a holy being? But in Julie's world, that's not a source of conflict. That's who she is. That's her world.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I think, you know, as an Indigenous woman going into academia, right? And when I write about Indigenous science, people always want that sacred knowledge, right? They're like, give me some examples that are only within your community that you can share. And I'm like, well, those examples are limited. And also going back to, right, to many papers have been written about, for instance, the Muche, the Zapotec community. And then when I able to read them, ¿verdad? Because they're in English and I have learned English, gone to school. There's no distribution acknowledgement. There is like nada. Even though these people came to our communities and collected all the data, they sat with our elders and, like she mentioned, right? They didn't even get a coca or like a soda or a gaseosa, right? To be able
Copy of
to,
the text, no? Or a
yeah,
copy of
tampoco.
or a photograph,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Wasn't even added to the paper, right? And they can do that. Like when you publish, you can add photos, but then these people are in a way expanding and excelling in their careers, right? Because I often find that when I write books, right, it's shocking that it's hard to find Indigenous people who have written about their communities. And obviously there's always anthropologists and people who, you know, just co-opted that knowledge. So I really liked and thank you for doing the way that you do your storytelling, right? Because it's important even for us, despite our identities, to reflect on our positionality, right? Like, what is that knowledge that we can share, even if these are all our own communities, and what is that knowledge that we have to credit? Y sometimes, like, even litos or my tias or my cousins don't have the same platform, right? And how do we make sure that their voices are also elevated? Porque, at the end of the day, is beyond just us, right? It's also, and that's very beautiful that you were able to give these two women that platform as well.
Dr. Olivia she's a mije. She has a PhD in boletus, so she's an expert in porcini. She's one of the leading experts in Mexican. And when she describes her life in a way, that Dr. Olivia is the future, could be the future of these two girls. If they decided to go into academia, I think they're not necessarily purely academic. They want to do other things. But, I just want to commend all this generation of even women before Julie and Lisa paved the way for. So I think for me, they were not directly my teachers, but I feel like they were my teachers. And they're my existential life teachers, my animal guide spirits. Yeah, these two doctors in the movie.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting them. Also, one of the things that struck to me the most was that you are focusing on women, right? And I mean, obviously, the title is Daughters of the Forest. What was some of the obstacles you faced trying to, in a way, create this? Right, because when we look at documentaries, as you were mentioning, men are elevated, especially in Latin America or Mexico, because of machismo, marianismo. What was it, some of the obstacles that you faced, if any obstacles that you faced when you were in a way promoting the script for this documentary and trying to get support and resources to make it happen?
It's very interesting. I think it was, on one hand, I think there was a lot of interest in women's stories, but I think that was never really the obstacle. The obstacle was, it was more about how the story was being navigated. Again, it's not trying to turn them into something that they're not. It's not trying to turn them into a hero that's fighting the loggers, because that's not their story, And I think at some point, trying to finance the film, and it's a woven story. It's not about one topic. There's multiple topics, but it's also not going to give you all the data that you want. I'm not going to tell you exactly which mushrooms to eat. I'm not going to tell you all of the reasons why psychedelics work the way they work in your brain. I'm not going to resolve the question whether the mushroom talks. So in a way, for the financing part, that was difficult. We had to get partners that were really in tune with keeping some things as mysteries, some things as, knowledge that doesn't belong to us, that we're just there as, we can get a sneak into this world, which we don't belong to, but we can get a sneak into it, which is a whole ecosystem. But this ecosystem is also very frail. It's consciously pressured by, the extinction of knowledge, the extinction of language, the extinction of our ecosystems as we know them. So it's not like it's not in danger, but the conflict and trying to turn, the story is not about the loggers, and that was a really big challenge, because it was, and also formally the film is less of a 3-act structure. Right? Where you the typical narrative hero journey. It was Lisa's story is a story of a sort of, she's a node between a lot of elements: the grandmother, the forest, her parents, and Julie is she wants something, but the ending is a little bit more open. So I get it was more of that. And then, if we're completely honest, as much as there is this, we like the trope of Indigenous women, but we don't really like to acknowledge them as furthermore than what they represent, as the complexities of, I think that was also, I felt like was we're constantly wanting to turn them into a trope. And I think we really as a team resisted that. And we had really good mentors, and we had a really good system of an advisory board and people that we worked with to get a better grip and an understanding. Because we do understand that we're outsiders. Yes, we're Mexican. I'm a Mexican woman, but my reality is very different from the reality of Lisa. So first acknowledging where you're positioned, then acknowledging that there's things you're never going to enter. But I think that was kind of the biggest challenge, is trying to tell a story that is more of a basket story, where we all expect, we expect answers, we expect to understand everything. And we expect certain stories of certain people because that fits our expectations. And I think that was kind of one of the hard parts. I mean, apart from discovering the film in itself and what it was going to look like and the form and the whole formal exploration, of what the film was going to be and how we were going to give presence to the non-human. Apart from all of the creative obstacles as a team, I think that was a challenge.
Yeah, and thank you for doing that because I feel like when we are conflict, right? Even having something that's mystery or mysterious can create conflict for the viewers, right? Like they're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
I wanted to know why." And like that's a conflict that oftentimes Western societies and cultures are in the way of our intention it can create, right? Because even like as a writer myself, right, sometimes I'm like I talk about indigenous science like I was mentioning, and people are like, give me that mystery, that why is there a mystery, why is there not a guide on what I can do as an academic to integrate indigenous science into my research. And I think that you do a great job, right? And I commend you for having an advisory board because oftentimes people don't want to invest the time or the resources to learn from an advisory board, right? They just want to do it themselves. And I think that that's in a way learning from the fungal systems, right? Like fungi, because they're interconnected systems that do not necessarily just arrive by themselves, right? Is that I guess individualism that we're often taught in in the world that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very inspired by what you said, and also I think that was an inspiration for us. Is this collective? It's this in the film. What we try to create is we wanted to like it's a system, it's an ecosystem where things are woven together, and it's part of a collective system. It's not. I mean, in a way, it sort of breaks away from the idea of the individual as a one sole thing. Yeah. Because the film had to be fungal, had to feel fungal as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, going off on that discussion, has there been any tensions that you have encountered while, traveling the world and showing the documentary from the audience? Or any questions that you have been asked that you're like, did they understand what we were trying to portray in the film? Like anything of that that you want to share?
I mean, I think there's always, I think people always, I mean, some people arrive, I mean, we've been very surprised with people that arrive with zero expectations. The people that come up with zero expectations get incredibly surprised. And the people from the fungal world really like it. Like, they really get it. They're like, yeah, it's not as, it doesn't have those slick time lapses, but it feels very fungal. Like, it feels very mycelium. It's about the film's about relationships, whether it's relationship to the land, relationship to my elders, relationship to each other, relationship to myself. It's about relationships rather than me labeling each mushroom or like the taxonomy of mushrooms or a psychedelic. So I think there's obviously, it's very interesting how sometimes it was perceived by text and how it's perceived by the Polish. The Polish have a really strong relationship with the mushrooms, but some of them really wanted more information. Like, but I wanted to know more about what the indigenous feel like exactly about things, And I was like, but what they're already saying is a lot. I mean, they have an entire catalog of 200 mushrooms, and kind of 5 different names for one that looks kind of the same. I mean, that's already an immense amount of knowledge. I mean, what more do you want? But I guess it's very interesting, the culture. I mean, obviously mushrooms are still create a lot of fascination, and they're still very invisible. There's still a lot to learn from them. So they do create a lot of fascination. I mean, we have been at CPH, we had like 9 screenings sold out in Australia. The second screening is about to sell out. South by the Audience Award was very unexpected. I kind of blame it on the mycologists, but thank the mycologists. I mean, but it really depends. Like, we're about to start, and by the fall, we hope to start showing the film back home and in the communities, and then start an impact campaign around, around indigenous knowledge, about the preservation of language, and and the elevation of foraging communities, or the strengthening. So that's going to be very interesting. I mean, we're very looking. I mean, in Chile, the reception was absolutely unexpected and wonderful. Chileans are an incredibly mycophilic community, and they have a really strong ancestral relationships with mushrooms, certain communities. So I mean, obviously, you never can everybody has an opinion when they see a movie and they have expectations. But in generally, we're very surprised. We're very grateful for every opportunity, and we just basically can't wait to to show it to foraging communities in Mexico. I mean, in a way, the way the film world's very contradictory because you kind of have to show the film around and then create some buzz and then go back home. Como, I don't know if you've heard this phrase in Spanish, pero nadie es profeta en su tierra. So I think so. So we can't wait, to start, because ultimately the foraging communities are still, in the market, they still have the worst spot. The foraging is such hard work. They're like foraging for hours and walking for hours, and it's a perishable thing. If you don't sell it, the next day it's rot. So they still like, a lot of them still like in extreme poverty. Right now, mushrooms are very trendy, but for a long time they were a food source for people that couldn't afford to eat something else. So, something that I spoke to the grandmother a lot, but she sort of mentions it in the movie, is that they were her food stores. I made her sometimes I asked her really mystical questions about, what mushrooms represent for you. And do you think they're for your family? And she was like, no, they're food and they're delicious and you can cook them this way. Mushrooms. They were so integrated in her part of life. Not. So I think we're looking forward to that stage of the movie.
And it's interesting, right? Because these are poverty in like foods that we have to consume, verdad? Just because of that. And we can think of quinoa in,
Mhm.
another example, acai also, and how they have been commodified in the sense that, oh, they're healthy, but for so long, for generations before they were commodified, these were the food sources that communities had to rely on much still.
No, and you see it in markets now when you want to like bring the price completely like down. This little bunch of mushrooms were like $2, and you want to like, be like, and you're like, it's not. I mean, this is a lot of work, and I think, something that you mentioned is the populations of psilocybin are suffering from over extraction. So this over demand has had a pressure on the ecosystem. That's the other thing on that I think, of course, with a psychedelic boom, I think there should be a little bit more acknowledgement and context and people's awareness of where they source and the context of the stories of where this knowledge comes from and where the actual, psilocybin comes from, whether it's forage. But yes, if you speak to some mycologists, some populations of psilocybin are threatened by over extraction.
Yeah, thank you so much, Otilia, for mentioning that. When I was reading también the direct statement, it mentioned, right, you're moving away from conquest narratives towards community and care. And I wanted to ask you, like, what influenced you to structure that way in the film, and also to mention that, right? Because I feel like, as we were discussing, oftentimes when we are looking at documentaries that portray Indigenous peoples, there's like this romanticization of like conquest, or as you were mentioning, conflict. So what inspired you to focus on community and care and approach that in the heart of the film as well?
I feel like there was this incredible, right now where there seems to a lot of violence permeates and a lot of cruelty and a lot of and a lot of the people in power promote war and this, so there's this sense and like being kind almost or taking care of your elder felt like, I take care of someone older, which my partner and I, we live with an elder. And I felt that was this very radical act. And I completely understood. I only understood it until you care for someone else, or even if it's an animal or a friend, that there was this radical act in being kind. And I know we are used to saying, oh, but those stories are the boring stories. No, the big stories are the ones in which people kill each other and in which there's destruction. There's this monster. And I really wanted to subvert that. I was like, what if the monster is not a monster? And what if the most radical thing you can do is take care of someone else? And that taking care of someone else also involves taking care of your little tree or your plant. And I felt like those became really radical acts in an era where everything is thought to be, not about being quiet and caring, but like bigger acts, like heroic. We're still in that frame. And I think the stories we tell do matter, and how we narrate our future and imagine our future, and how we're going to imagine the future. We don't reimagine our stories. So for us, that felt really important. That was what I was also observing, and that's how I wanted to practice my life, and so I feel like they were, for me, very radical acts, and I was like, why not change who we perceive as heroes? Why don't we transform that?
That's beautiful. It kind of reminded me of like what is matriarchy, verdad? Because coming from a matriarchal society like the Zapotec community, like we still practice matriarchy. Obviously, there's some things that we have lost because of religion, colonization in that matriarchal structure. Pero caring for elders, caring for your parents, caring for your grandparents is a part of matriarchy, right? And oftentimes when we hear people say, oh, we should return back to the matriarchy, I'm like, are people really willing to stop being selfish in the sense that they are open to caring for elders now or their parents? Because in Western society, ¿verdad? Like most parents are dropped off, or elders are dropped off retirement homes because obviously the station sometimes like prevents us from taking care of our parents because we have to work or because they have health issues. But in a way, a matriarchy is in a way working with the community, right, to take care of our elders so that we don't just abandon them. And I think that it's hard with that because that caring demia, like we are taught individualism, ¿verdad? Like when I do this film, when I do this paper, this is Jessica's paper, this is Jessica's film. And as you were the film, right? This wasn't just a film about one Indigenous woman. Like even she talked about, the elder talked about how it was communal knowledge, right? She brought it back to the community. And that was very beautiful to see because it's disrupting that mainstream discourse that everything has to be individualistic, ¿verdad? Like even I have seen some of your interviews, like, or even this interview, right? You're not just talking about Otilia Padua, like the filmmaker. You're talking about the community, the advisory board that also shaped the film. So I was wondering, like, what else did you learn about creating this film that has, in a way, disrupted the ways that you have been taught, ¿verdad? And this is like the beautiful thing about working with Indigenous communities from different parts of the world. We are forced to unlearn and relearn the ways that we have been taught so that we can do better for the future and have more hope as well.
I mean, I was educated in a very, Western prestige schools where there's a lot of very intelligent people, but they're very hierarchical, they're very vertical, and they're very driven by the sense of individual success. And I think something that we need to relearn is what is success, what does success look like, and what does it mean. And also, a little bit remove the myth of this authorial like genius that art. I mean, of course, there's artists that did paintings, and there's obviously individual genius. I mean, in a sense, but are they? I mean, they're also like a sense of collective shaped by their context, their wives helping out. I mean, someone was taking care of Bach's kids. He had like 11. I mean, I don't know if he had 11 kids, but I mean, there's this whole and what I've seen is we've elevated these figures of the artist figure, and so we do the same with cinema and with filmmakers. But they're cinema is a collective piece of work. Architecture, like I was trained in architecture, we celebrate the star architects, but architecture is made so many parts and so many individuals, and plumbing and electricity, all these collective things that come together, and when they work the best is when they work together in the best sense, and when they work collectively. And I really believe that in cinema. And so I think most beautiful films are made by a lot of people. Yes, I mean, sometimes the filmmaker is the one that is in front giving all the interviews, but I strongly believe that there's so many forces. And I mean, this particular film, I don't think it's my vision. I think it grew naturally by a collection of visions. You can always argue that another filmmaker was different, and it's like he imposes his vision or he expresses his vision, and everybody wants to make it. But even then, a lot of people work on it. A lot of people make that vision materialize. So I think cinema, architecture, and a lot of our stuff is reshape how we structure, and that there are collective efforts, and we ourselves biologically are not an individual. We're a collective of things, and we're in a better place. Our biome is in shape. And I mean, I have one of the doctors in the mycology lab, always when he says hello to you, he says hello to you and all of the organisms that shape you. Hello to you and all of your organisms. And I really like that about Dr. Jesus. And I think I've had a lot of teachers, and I feel like the best thing about life is when you are curious and retain that curiosity and don't think you know it all. And when you just stay and think, oh, I know it all, and there's nothing to be learned. I feel like life's more interesting when you're still curious and when there's so much to learn, and you'd be surprised by the places that you can learn a lot of things from.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, because I feel like oftentimes, even in academia, right, like when I mentor Indigenous students, they struggle in individualism, right? Because oftentimes they're like, well, so and so is this amazing Indigenous professor, or has done a TEDx, TED talk, and they're amazing. But oftentimes, right, I'm like, are they really like just an individual? If like finding like being the sole author, like what about the communities that they're working with? What about the communities that shape their viewpoints? And sometimes, like you were saying, being trained in Western academia, it teaches us that we have to aspire to be individualistic creatures so that we can be successful within the metrics that academia instills in us, verdad? Like they're like, oh, Otilia, you have to get like this award, and to be that the success that is defined in our fields. So that's very beautiful that you're sharing that as well. And then my next question is like, to give us the title, right, Daughters of the Forest, because I think it's very beautiful. And like, what inspired the title, or what was the process in identifying that title of the film?
For many years, the film took 6 years to make. So for a long time, the film was called The Queendom. And losing the Queendom was tough on many levels, because we felt, I read this book called Radical Mycology, and it was the first time it referred to the fungal kingdom as the Queendom. And I was like, the Queendom. And so for us losing, there were a lot of reasons why we would lose the Queendom eventually. The first one was there was another documentary around that was called Queendom, and it was about a trans Russian artist. So that was the first. And then there was like a bigger one, but we didn't want to address it because we didn't want to lose the Queendom, which is we have to have a Spanish title. This is a Mexican movie. You can't have an English title. And Queendom was untranslatable in Spanish. Reina, reinado, it was not the same. So actually bigger than even having the other documentary was like, we don't have a Spanish title. And then the third one, now that I thought about it later, was actually the Queendom is still hierarchical. The Queendom is still the queen at the top, and the fungal world is much more like that. So after, like we went around the title for so many days, and then there's this friend of mine, she's a writer and she's a composer, a music composer from Texas. You'd be like, very surprised. We were like navigating stories, and then she was like, Daughters of, Mycelium Chronicles, which is the second title, which had to do with sci-fi, referring back to sci-fi. It's a sort of second title in the movie, but it's the least one known. But it was like, Daughters of the Forest, like, an anthology, like making it something epic, but of an epic universe, but anchoring it on the fungal world. And then sort of like she threw Daughters of the Forest. And I was like, Daughters of the Forest. And then I like that because there's so many daughters in that. And so it's very simple, but it has all these levels. And then actually, so I kind of again grew out of a collaboration. Like it didn't grow like I didn't even come up with the title. But it made sense to know, like at the end I was like, yeah, it makes sense to, the Queendom is still a very strict organization, still like on top. And this was like, who's the daughters? Are they the girls in the movie? Are they the fungus? Who are they? So there's many daughters in the movie, and the forest has this being, and they're all part of this being. So the forest has the elder. So it had this beautiful simplicity, and at the same time a lot of potential for layers about its meaning.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think that when I think I was, when I was reading about the Queendom also, and also like the mycelial network, I think they missed the mark that like our forests are matriarchal, but also matrilineal, right? That there's no hierarchy doesn't necessarily mean that women are at the top. And I think oftentimes people like, because translating indigenous contexts like matriarchy, matrilineal, they're missing really the point of what that means. ¿Verdad? Like even when you translate to Spanish or English, there's the loss of definition. Because even for the organization Earth Daughters, we were Yun, which is a mystic word that means like close to Earth daughters, but it shows a deeper relationship that as daughters of Mother Earth we have, right? But even when you're translating it to English or Spanish, it's different. It's different in that sense. And my last question, and we thank you for having this amazing interview, and I hope that people watch your film, and we will ask you so where to people can watch it. It's like, what do you hope viewers take away about indigenous knowledge, science, and our relationship to non-human worlds after watching Daughters for Earth? Like, what are some of the takeaways you hope that people can come in with those intentions to want to learn, unlearn, or relearn from watching the film?
I mean, I certainly hope that next time they see like a mushroom, they can understand all the things that like all the stories that maybe fed into like you having a mushroom and like what it took for it to be in your plate or the person that's selling it to you. And and the next time, I mean, I also hope, I mean, in the terms of psychedelics, if you're ever having it in Mexico, like having a bigger awareness of its context. And ultimately, I hope that, it re-questions how we perceive what the heroes and the people that inspire us, and that we consider that there are people out there trying to generate better futures constantly. There are people working there. They're not maybe in the front lines, they're not in the headlines, but they're there. And maybe they inspire you to like do something around you or get more aware of or connect with other people. And also this idea of, and the other, like how we relate. Because one thing is, okay, I'm going to take care of the people I love, but what about taking care of your community? What about taking care of the people you don't know? I mean, it can expand to the other, and to having some empathy on the other and the difference and the richness of difference. And then when we talk about indigeneity, it's not just one monolith. There's many groups. They have very different knowledge. They have very different relationships with their knowledge. And so, I mean, I hope it inspires people. I mean, this girls in the fungal world inspire and inspire people, and that you can work with things around you if maybe you learn to observe your environment in a different way. And it's only about like you trying to get out of it. What can you get out of it is like what can be, in a way they, when they forage, they touch the pilia so that it drops the spore so that there's more mushrooms later on. And I really like that concept. I think we should apply it to a lot of things and how we approach life. Okay, I'm going to take, but what am I going to give back? And this is sort of dance. And I mean, in reply to your question, the film is still in sort of the festival circuit. There's more information in Daughters of the Forest Film on Instagram, and we will start an impact campaign. So that means we hopefully will have a lot of impact screenings, and yeah, and it generates discussions and bridges, connects people. It's about, our social web has been very damaged, and hopefully this film helps a little bit on how we weave back those connections and relationships between one. Julie is very different than Liz, and there's other groups of indigenous community. And another thing, for the Tlahuica Pejaco, the thing is, Zapotecs, there's a lot of people that still speak Zacotec, but some people in the north part don't necessarily understand everything in Zapotec than people that live in the lower valleys. So even the language, and the thing with the loss of the Tlahuica is that when we lose a language, we lose, like we were talking about translation, there's a loss of like an understanding of the world that we'll never maybe know because that language got lost. So, I mean, one of our impact thing is to like preserve as much as I mean, already Liz has done a lot, like by naming the mushrooms in Tlahuica. They've named 100 versions. That was through the grandmothers and the elders that she was able to catalog all this incredible information. She has a published thesis that it's like a collective effort. I mean, it says Liz, but it's a collective effort. And yes, I think so. It's the sense that it's not, it's not like it's not a monolith. In Mexico, it's Native Americans, whether it's in Bolivia or it's in Peru, are complex, and there's many forces, and then there's there's evangelical indigenous people, there's Catholics. It's not a monolith that you can explain by thinking you understand the trope. It's nuanced, and yeah. So hopefully the film will create some curiosity, and at the same time accept that there's a mystery of life that we don't need to fully explain to engage with it. We don't fully need to explain the other to empathize with.
Yeah, and that's very important, right? Because like my dad's community is Maya Chorti, my mom is Zapotec, and even within those communities, like Maya Chorti, we tend to be more Christian versus in Oaxaca we're more Catholics, and obviously even those religions are very different, and obviously
Right.
there's people who don't identify with neither, right? It's also it's but in United States, I feel like indigeneity, especially from Mexico or Latin America, has become this monolithic topic. Where oftentimes everybody from Latin America is indigenous, or everybody from Mexico is indigenous, and it's because people have been removed from what it means to be living in Mexico, ¿verdad? Because there is like really clear divides, and it's not denying the ancestry, because obviously there everybody has some type of ancestry, pero when it comes to indigenous communities, right, our people are still oppressed. They're still denied basic needs, even healthcare, education, access to education.
Yeah.
But in the United States, because people have a hard time understanding that they're also part of the oppressive regime in Mexico, or their identities are
Yeah.
like they
Yeah.
want to remove themselves from it. And they're like, well, I'm also indigenous. And I'm like, like it does more harm than good sometimes, but it's hard to explain that to people, right? Because then they're like, oh, you're policing identities, you're being violent. But in reality, it's like, how do indigenous peoples bring that to light? Especially, I don't know if you have encountered that, coming to the United States, but it's a different discourse that they're portraying about indigeneity
Yeah.
than
True.
than the realities
Mhm.
that
Yeah, yeah,
exist.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've never lived in the United States, so like, I mean, I have a friend with me right now. She's from USC, so now she was traveling to explain me the whole identity, how it's perceived and the racism in the US, and how there's also racism in Mexico, of course, and how it's different. And I necessarily grasp the whole concept. I mean, I can grasp it in Mexico and in my, coming from the city, being educated in like fancy schools. That sort of structure, like even to me untrained that, has been decades. But I still think I have a lot of learning to like, what is it like? Even me being a Mexican, just visiting as, a bilingual Mexican here, that just visiting is a very different experience. So I feel like I'm still learning about the discourse and what they mean. I do sometimes think like tend to make a monolith out of everything, or even the concept of community, like, oh, community is this thing that, and community can be complicated too. It's not like it all works fancy in a utopia. It's agreements. And like, for example, in Lisa's community, we go to the comisariado and we go to the delegados and we explain them what they want to do. And this men that transition, and most of them are men. I mean, in some towns there's women, but in a lot of the towns there's still men. And so, the forms of how they, and for Lise was very important that we approached in the whole form the community systems. And so even then, navigating that, and I think I feel like I think I still have a lot to learn. And some things I think are going to be very difficult for me to deprogram myself completely from my upbringing.
We thank you so much for your time today.
No, I mean, I appreciate, like, I really appreciate this conversation. I really appreciate and aren't all with what you're doing. I mean, the first time I came across with Earth Daughters, I was like, yeah, exactly. And it was very inspiring, and it was wonderful. I think there's a lot of audience that is, a lot of, people like you, doctor, that are, lots of like girls like you that I think could be like a really strong inspiration. There's a lot of girls in Latin America that need to know there's all these possibilities of navigating. They don't have to stay in like the past and the present. They can, they can shape what, like, whatever they want to define for themselves and their communities in many different ways. And I think I love that platforms like you exist. And I think I really appreciate the time that you had to share with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode.